Joining me now, upfront journalist and author Michael Seth Starr. For more than 28 years, Michael covered television for the New York Post. He's written numerous biographies about many of the greats, including Don Rickles, Bob Newhart, Bobby Darin, and Ringo Starr, to name a few. His latest book about the life of comedian Rodney Dangerfield is titled Nothin Comes Easy. Michael joins us now from New York. We welcome you. Thank you for taking some time out. And I got to begin by asking you, what prompted you to take Rodney as a bio person?
Ross, I always sort of tend to look for people who haven't been written about yet. And 2024, Rodney's will mark the 20th anniversary of Rodney's passing. And, I figured he was such an iconic comedian. And nobody had ever written his life story. I mean, there have been obviously interviews with him, and he wrote his own book right before he passed away in 2004. But that was mostly anecdotes and funny stories. I wanted to take a quote unquote, serious/fun look at his life and his career. Because he remains, even 20 years after his death, such an iconic comedian, beloved still in these times.
Where did you start?
It's a good question, Ross. When you do these sorts of books, biographies like I do, you're pretty much all over the place. I mean, you're looking for people perhaps from Rodney's past in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. One day, the next day, you're up to people he made movies with in the 80s and 90s.
Mhm.
So I kind of went back and forth and sort of filled in the holes as I went along, tracing his life back, to his birth in Queens, New York, up through the ranks of the comedy circuit, then taking a decade off to sell aluminum siding and paint, and then back into the comedy circuit as we know him as Rodney Dangerfield, and then ascending the heights. So kind of back and forth all through the process.
So there is no real process that you have ironed out over the years that you do for everybody. It's different for each subject.
It's different for each subject, but the same in that the template I use is not sticking in one particular era. Um, you have to sort of spread your wings, and when you're putting together somebody's life, going back to their birth, you have to look at all eras of their life and try to zero in on important things that happened in each of those eras. Hopefully, talk to some people from each of those eras. Now, Rodney would have been over 100 years old had he been alive, so the chances of me getting anybody who knew him as a kid were very slight, and I didn't.
And
Or
you
getting him who knew him in high school.
and you also went to some of his roots, starting with his father, and I'm interested in that a bit. His Phil, right?
His father, Phil Cohen, was a vaudevillian, yes. Phil and his brother, Adolph Cohen, had a vaudeville act called Roy and Arthur. And they were fairly successful for their time. Later on in Rodney's career, when he was on the Tonight Show, he held up a picture of his father back in the vaudeville days posing with Charlie Chaplin. So and Eddie Cantor, their paths crossed with a lot of vaudevillians who would become very, very famous later in life.
And his dad from New York or from Europe? Where did his father come from?
Father was from New York. Rodney's grandparents were from Europe on both sides. Both his parents were born here.
And this, I'm just interested. This was not an easygoing guy, correct? A tough guy.
He was, he loved Rodney, but he was never around. I think what Rodney always regretted about his childhood was he had no relationship with his father because he was on the road constantly. He would come home maybe twice a year, 3 times a year, take Rodney from Queens into Manhattan for an hour and a half, get an ice cream, take him back. And they didn't talk much, and that was the extent of their relationship. So he really had no father figure early in life. And he did have his mother, obviously, who was a very cold-hearted person. Rodney described her as that, and, showed no love toward her son. Didn't have much relationship with his father either because he was never there. They never divorced, his parents, but so it was kind of a loveless childhood for Rodney without hardly any parental supervision.
So this is a kid growing up in Queens without very much supervision, as you say. Went to, and I always knew this, but you cemented it and confirmed it. Went to my alma mater. I don't know when he graduated, but he went to Richmond Hill High School in Queens. What? Uh, there's folklore about what it said in the yearbook. I'll get to that in a second. But what kind of a student was he, or was he a student at all?
Rodney was a decent student in high school. He really was. But he didn't have much time. He was always working odd jobs at a candy store or driving a truck. So he didn't have that much time to devote to his studies, but he was an above average student.
We always heard that he went to our high school, went down through the years, and it said in the year, so it said underneath the
Yes.
yearbook picture, you tell me if it was true. Jack, was it Jack Roy or Jack Cohen?
Jack Cohen at that point.
Jack Cohen. Underneath, he slept by day.
That's yeah, I think that was a joke, but he
It
did
the yearbook thing for me.
yeah, yeah. I mean, he did attend school regularly, and he was present, and he played some sports.
So
But
take me from the Rodney Dangerfield at Richmond Hill High School and going back and forth from Queens into the city to getting into the real world of stand-up.
well, Rodney always wrote jokes, even as a kid, and yeah, and all through high school he was writing jokes. He was big fan of the comedians at the time, Milton Berle, Fred Allen, those sorts of people. When he was 19, after he graduated, he decided he was going to become a full-time comedian. So he went up to the Borscht Belt, the Catskills, for a summer to ply his trade and write jokes, and do an act. Didn't go so well, but it went well enough that he had some motivation to continue this. And he changed his name he was born Jacob Cohen, and he was known in high school, as you mentioned, as Jack Cohen. He changed his name to Jack Roy, taking his father's vaudevillian last name, Phil Royce.
Was he
And
was he
I'm
trying
sorry, again.
was he trying to emulate his father? Was he there a bit of that?
I think from the showbiz aspect, yes, but he wasn't a vaudevillian, and he wasn't doing that quite kind of an act. And he wasn't touring, in the theaters and with a partner and all that. So I think maybe as an homage to his father, he took his stage name because I guess he felt Jack Cohen wasn't going to get him very far. But he started to. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was saying, so he's not doing so well. He's starting to work his way through the Borscht Belt, not much success. What happens then?
Well, he comes back to New York. He starts playing the clubs in the boroughs: Manhattan, Queens, Staten Island, the Bronx. Never a top draw, but as an MC, as Jack Roy, gets his name in the papers a few times. Works up an act, a lot of imitations of famous stars. Which was what a lot of people did at that time. There was no respect. The no respect shtick was not part of his act at that time. He was more doing imitations and emceeing and telling stale jokes, that sort of thing. But he wasn't that successful at it. And for about a decade, from about 1940 to 50, he plied his trade in the clubs. Sometimes he would make $250, $300 a week. Some weeks were better than others, but he kept at it. But then he met a singer in a club named Joyce Indig, who would become his wife. And they married in the early 50s, and he wasn't Rodney then. Jack Roy decided that he now had a wife. They wanted to start a family. He wasn't doing so well in the comedy business. So he would sort of chuck that and start a new life as a businessman. And he had a company here in northern New Jersey that sold aluminum siding and real estate, and paint. I'm sorry, aluminum siding and paint. He was fairly successful at that, actually. He was a good salesman, known for telling jokes to people, and he was still writing, by the way, at this point.
Mhm.
He had like a satchel full of jokes that he described writing as jokes as him for an addiction. He had to do it. And he did. So he had this business as a aluminum siding and paint salesman. based in Englewood in northern New Jersey. Um, Fairly successful, but was keeping himself out of the clubs at this point, and playing the role of domestic father, living the suburban life. It really wasn't for him though. And as a matter of fact, in the late 1950s, he got himself into trouble with the FBI for a scam trying to bilk the Federal Housing Administration out of money.
Hmm.
It was a complicated scheme with aluminum siding salesmen and their clients putting in phony claims to the FHA and then splitting the money that they got back. And Rodney was arrested by the FBI in the late 50s because they were cracking down on these scams pulled by these by these aluminum siding salesmen. He didn't go to jail. He paid about a $2,000 fine. And interestingly enough, one of the people who was arrested with Rodney, who worked with him, was a guy named Joe Ansis, who would figure prominently in Rodney's life from then on. Joe Ansis was a guy that Rodney called the funniest man he ever met, but he didn't want to be in show business. He was deathly afraid of going on stage, but he was legendary for his sense of humor, and he was good friends. Joe Ansis was with Lenny Bruce, and was a big influence on Lenny Bruce also.
Oh.
Rodney knew Lenny Bruce from the clubs, and they hung out together a little bit. So it's at this point that Joe Ansis comes into Rodney Dangerfield's life as a sort of helping him shape and act, being an inspiration for his jokes, helping him develop his onstage persona, thereabouts. So Rodney's marriage wasn't going great. His son was born in 1960. And it was around that time that Rodney figured, you know what? He was getting tired of he never really loved the aluminum siding business, and so he called it a colorless job selling paint. He was successful, but he wasn't that happy doing it. He really wanted to get the showbiz bug never really left him. So around 1960, 61, he decides that he's going to get back into the club scene. He didn't completely leave his business. He was still selling aluminum siding at this point, but he figured, you know what, I'm gonna why not? He always had that itch to get back on stage, so he decides that he's gonna go back in front of live audiences in the clubs around New York City.
Mhm.
But he tells one of the old club owners when he decides to go back, it was a club that he had played previously, and he didn't want the club owner to use his old name of Jack Roy because he didn't want people to remember that it was him, that maybe somebody had seen him the first time around, that he wanted to sort of be a fresh name and a fresh face. So he told the club owner not to identify him. He said, just pick a name. I don't want to don't introduce me as Jack. Don't, when you advertise in the newspaper, don't say Jack Roy.
Uh-huh.
So the club owner, so the story goes, picks the name Rodney Dangerfield.
The club owner says, now you're
Club owner, so now you're Rodney Dangerfield.
okay.
Now, Rodney Dangerfield isn't, Jack Benny used the name Rodney Dangerfield on his radio show several times. It wasn't a new name. Well, it was a fairly new name that most people hadn't heard of, but it had been used on the Jack Benny show, and on Ozzie and Harriet by their the oldest son. In an episode his alter ego was Rodney Dangerfield.
David David Nelson?
No, it was Ricky. I'm sorry, not Ricky Nelson.
Uh-huh.
But let's face it, people really didn't know the name. So Jack Roy, he goes from Jacob Cohen to Jack Cohen to Jack Roy, now to Rodney Dangerfield.
Uh-huh.
And he goes back into the clubs, moderately successful, not an overnight success by any means. I mean, we're also factoring in the 10 years he took off in between. So, no overnight success there, but he's he's 40 now, in his early 40s. Works his way up in the clubs, mostly in Manhattan, and begs his agent to get him to Rodney. The pinnacle of success at that point was getting a spot on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was huge for any performer.
Sure.
We know the Beatles, obviously, in 1964, biggest TV audience ever at that point, 73 million people. But if you were a comedian, and you got onto the Ed Sullivan Show and you were successful, you got called back, you got huge television exposure, and you can pretty much write your own ticket after that if things went well.
Right.
So he begs his agent to get him on the Ed Sullivan Show. Rodney's agent gets him a spot to warm up the audience before the show during the dress rehearsal. And the producers of the Ed Sullivan Show liked him so much that they invited him to be a guest on an upcoming show. And I think he made his first appearance in March of 1967. So he was 45 at that point, going on 46. So fairly old for a comedian at that point to be making his first national television appearance. But he did it. He did it well. And he was asked back. And suddenly he was on the Ed Sullivan Show, and he was being called to appear elsewhere. Mike Douglas and the Joey Bishop Show, which came along in late night in 1967. Excuse me.
Right, Joey had a
Challenge.
He was up against Carson.
Right, to challenge Johnny Carson. So Rodney was a guest on his show, and Mike Douglas and Merv Griffin, Dinah Shore. He started making all the rounds, and that gave him a huge exposure, and he started to make a name for himself. And the one thing he didn't like was he was very attached to his two children, Brian and Melanie, and he was divorced at this point, and he did not like to travel a lot. He didn't like, he lived in New York City. He preferred to be in New York and performing in New York, where the Sullivan Show was. I mean, he was flying to L.A. He did the Dean Martin Show, and and the Tonight Show wasn't yet in L.A. It was still in Manhattan, and he did the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson from New York. But he decides that in order to be able to stay home more, he's going to open up his own comedy club, and he does that. In September of 1969, he opens up his own club called Dangerfield's Comedy Club on East 61st Street in Manhattan. And against all odds, the club is a success. Rodney appeared there himself most nights early on in the run. But he was able to talk about the club when he was on promote the club on television. And he drew a lot of celebrity people in New York and elsewhere when they came in. Jack Benny was a huge fan. And, it was at the club, as was Milton Berle, and all the big comics of the time would come to Dangerfield's to see Rodney when he was there. So the club, at that point, comedy clubs in New York weren't a thing. They would become so in the 70s, but in 1969, not so much. There was the Improv, but Dangerfield's becomes a resounding success. And Rodney sunk about $250,000 into the club. He got his money back eventually. And Dangerfield's became a landmark in New York City and was in business in its former iteration until COVID, until 2020, where they had to shut down. It's now opened under another name. I think it's called Rodney's, but Dangerfield's not associated with it.
But if Dangerfield, which it was an amazing success, and the Sullivan years, pardon me, also an amazing success, it was Johnny's Tonight Show, in my estimation, tell me, that really brought him to prominence with everyday Americans, no?
No, I would agree. As much as Don Rickles was one of Johnny's favorites, so was Rodney Dangerfield. And he would prepare for each performance on the Tonight Show. He said he had like over 200 jokes. He would map out his appearances on, what he was going to do in the stand-up portion, what he was going to talk about with Johnny in the panel, different subjects he wanted to talk about in the panel, jokes he had for each of those situations. And he would map them out very carefully. I don't think in the end he really needed them, because Johnny was such a great audience and just let him go when he was on.
It was almost like autopilot. He would just hey, let him go. Was he? It was mostly self-deprecation. In fact, the whole act, and we all identified with it. What about Rodney's? Let me tell you, Johnny. Let me tell you about my wife. Everything was woe is me, but it worked. What was it about that we all identified with?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. It was a self-deprecation, and everybody has feelings of inadequacy and I'm not good enough to do this, or this happened to me in my life. I don't get no respect, or people don't think enough of me. And Rodney took that concept and basically that was his entire shtick. His entire persona was the guy who gets no respect. Um, Even from, his parents. I was so ugly when I was I was an ugly kid. I was so ugly when I was born. The doctor slapped my mother. Then he slapped the nurse for good measure. Like that kind of thing. And I have some, I have jokes of his throughout the book. But they're very, my wife was afraid of the dark. Then she saw me naked. Now she's afraid of the light. Like that sort of thing. People love that because everybody could relate to the self-deprecation. He was no better than anybody else was the thing.
During the '80s, it was almost like water cooler stuff. If you saw him on the Tonight Show, you were doing, I know, a group in my office, I was doing a television show and watching it. We were all doing Rodney.
Yeah, I got
Yeah,
hey,
something, hey, yeah. Viddy Boom, Dr. Viddy Boom Butts. Where did that come from? Every time he'd say, my Dr. Viddy Boom Butts, the audience would go crazy.
Yeah, that was just one of his creations, Vinnie Boom Bots, and it's almost like the audience waited for him to say that. Even on the Tonight Show,
Yes. Yeah.
he would bring him up. Johnny would prompt him, "How you feeling, Rodney?" "Oh, my Dr. Vinnie Boom Bots," and that sort of thing. So
He got me
it was,
stuck chewing gum, he put me on cigarettes. I mean, he did one after the other after the other.
yeah, he had such a fertile comic imagination, and the remarkable thing is he wrote almost all of his own jokes. He did buy jokes from comedians from time to time,
Right.
who would write in sort of in his style, but he did write most of his own material.
Did success bring him happiness? What did it bring him? What were the '80s and the '90s like for him?
Rodney was a very multi-layered personality and was never really, and people in the book say this too, people I spoke to, he wasn't a very happy person. And even he said that. He had a very, obviously had a very unhappy childhood, didn't have a successful first marriage. He did later on get married to a woman named Joan, and that marriage was successful. They had a terrific marriage, but he was an unhappy man, and I think he masked his unhappiness and his insecurity, as many comedians do, through humor. And he also smoked, excuse me, Ross, he smoked a lot of marijuana, which I think helped his mood. He had been smoking marijuana since his early 20s. It was a lifelong, he talked about it in his own book, it was a lifelong enjoyment for him,
Mhm.
pretty much. And I think that helped him deal with life and adversity. I wouldn't, he did come to great success in the 80s.
Yeah.
Particularly with Caddyshack and Back to School and the Rapping Rodney video, and the younger comedians loved him and the kids loved him. Rock and roll stars loved him. He was dubbed the first rock and roll comics by somebody it mentions in the book.
He was also a
So
very nice guy. He was great to talk to. He was great to talk host. I was hosting a show in Washington, DC. He was a great guest then. Out here in Los Angeles. Couldn't have been nicer. He did have that demeanor where he was just kind of a nice person to deal with. Am I right on that?
yes, yes, he was, and very honest. And I read hundreds of interviews of Rodney. He was very honest. And towards the end of his life, he gave an interview. I think it was in Parade magazine, where he talked openly about his battle with depression. And he was seeing psychoanalysts, and he was in therapy, but he never really found that true. I feel that true inner happiness, even when his career was going great guns.
Even there, and I think it is in your book. Went to the psychiatrist, and they told him I was suicidal. He said he wanted me to pay in advance.
Yeah. Sure. Everything was a joke, but I think that's how we dealt with it. That's how a lot of unhappy comedians, especially, we always say they're laughing on the outside, crying on the inside. I don't think he was crying on the inside, but he was at the root of his personality, a depressive sort of personality.
At the time of his death, was he married?
He was. He was married to Joan.
Joan.
They were married about 10 years at that point. They had a very sick Rodney met her when he was out trying to lose weight at a place called the Pritikin Center in Los Angeles. They met in Santa Monica. She owned a very successful flower business, and they dated for a while, and then they got married. She was, I think, about 30 years younger than Rodney, but he had a very successful marriage, and I think that really brightened his life considerably, in the last decade and a half.
What surprised you most as you did your research, as you did the book? What surprised you most about Rodney?
I think it was the thing that even I sort of knew this before writing the book. It was fascinating to me was that stepping away from the comedy his first go round in about 1940, just completely chucking it and going into selling aluminum siding. Was like, what? Rodney Dangerfield paint?
He was the original Tin Man.
Yeah, he was in that era, and that it surprised me in the sense that he stuck with it for so long, for over a decade, a little bit over a decade. And the fact that he never stopped writing jokes even during that time, it surprised me his relationship with Joe Ancis, who I mentioned earlier, who was a very big influence on Rodney's life and career. Later on, Joe actually lived with Rodney on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. They had their own bedrooms. Joe was separated from his wife, so he moved in with Rodney. He would hang out at Dangerfield's, and Rodney always credited him when he did mention him as the funniest guy he ever knew. So there's sort of this guy in the background named Joe Ancis. And there isn't that much known about him per se. I did interview somebody who was going to try to write a book about Joe, but it never came to fruition. I did interview Joe's daughter for the book, and she was very helpful, talking about him and his relationship with Rodney. And I mean, they loved each other as as performers and as two people, as friends. Um, they had a falling out towards the end of Joe Ancis's life, but um, he continued to live and he moved out of Rodney's apartment towards the end. But the Joe Ancis aspect to me was interesting also, and the fact that Rodney was so giving to the younger comedians of the day. The Sam Kinnisons, Robert Wall, Pauly Shore. I interviewed a lot of these people for the book.
Mhm.
Rita Rudner, Harold Leifer, and they all talked so glowingly of Rodney and how he was such an influence on them and how he nurtured their talent and would recommend them for jobs and give them breaks and invite them onto the stage on Dangerfields. And it was just so nice to hear. I think in a way because he didn't feel threatened. At this point, he was his late 40s, early 50s. He had made it finally. And he didn't feel threatened by the younger generation anyway, because nobody was doing what he was doing. It was only Rodney Dangerfield. So it didn't really matter to him to help people who had different sort of acts come up. And Robert Klein he was a big influence on Robert Klein also.
Yeah, there are so many comedians that will say, Johnny was the king of comedy, king of late night, but Rodney, they hold a special place for. It really is. You hit that nail on the head. These comedians, and that's true of his funeral, correct? They were Paul Bear's
Yes.
funeral.
Paul Bear, everybody showed up. And I mean, I'm just looking, guys like Bob Nelson and Michael O'Keefe, who he was in Caddyshack with.
Mhm.
We haven't mentioned Caddyshack, but that was, in addition to the Tonight Show later on, Caddyshack really cemented his icon status. It was the first movie. It was well, he made a movie called The Projectionist in 1970, but it was a B or a C level movie. It was low budget. Nobody saw it. He had a supporting role in that, but he had a bigger role in Caddyshack as Al Czervik.
He was a good actor. He was actually a good actor in there.
He was a good actor. When he first came onto the Caddyshack set, he didn't really know how to act, and he was disappointed when, like, when he would do his lines and nobody would laugh, and the director, Howard Ramis, had to tell him, "Rodney, they can't laugh. They're the crew. It's not a nightclub. Just do your lines." And he didn't really know the art of filmmaking, but he picked it up very quickly. And Howard Ramis would work with him before each scene, or at night, they would go over the dialogue together. And he was a natural. He really
Here again,
was.
pardon me, here again, water cooler lines. Hey, everybody, we're going to get laid. That's just indelible. Line after line, Rodney after Rodney, whether with a stand-up or some of the movies. Um, a couple of minutes we have left. Michael, what are you hoping readers will come away with from this book?
I hope that readers will get a sense of everybody in their mind has their version of Rodney Dangerfield. It's usually the stand-up comedian, moving his tie around, slumping his shoulders, sweating, wiping his brow. Yeah, yeah, I'll tell you.
I'll tell
Yini Boombat, as you mentioned before.
Yeah.
But I hope that the book shows a side of him that people might not know, and what he was like when he was off stage, and what went into making him who he was, and what he had to go through in his career to get to the point where he finally made it in his late 40s. And it was no overnight success, believe me.
And he would, those jokes with Johnny over and over. I landed at the airport. I got in a taxi. Said, "Take me to some action." He took me to my house. Over and over, and it's you still laughed. You knew it was coming, but you
Yeah.
waited for it.
That was the magic. And he had hundreds of them, and he would just come up with them off the top of his head. He put a lot of work into his joke writing, obviously, but he just had this miraculous knack for coming up with those self-deprecating one-liners.
And going full circle to what brings you to a subject. What's your next subject? What inspires you to go after somebody for a biography?
Well, I'm currently working on a biography of Bob Newhart, which I hope will be out next year. I had a chance to. I never had a chance to interview Rodney when he was alive. I did have a chance to interview Bob Newhart when I was at the New York Post, and I once had a few Bobby Darin years ago, and I interviewed Bob for that, and for the Post for TV stories. Nicest man in the world. Again, different career arc than Rodney. He was a lot younger, but came out of nowhere with this stand-up comedy album called The Button Down Mind of Bob Newhart, and then launched this whole comedy career, 2 mega successful sitcoms, The Big Bang Theory later in his career, Young Sheldon, Mark Twain Prize. I mean, he did everything.
And he was so
So, yeah.
deadpan. So deadpan.
So, yeah, so different from Rodney.
Yeah.
It did, 180, 360 degrees, I would guess, or 180 degrees.
And also compatible there, you already did the Rickles book.
Yes, good friends with Don Rickles, of course. They were best friends. Bob and his wife Ginny, and Don and Barbara Rickles. So
If ever there were opposites on that one, one
Yeah.
one very calm, cool, and the other one off the wall. So that's what I mean when you pick a person. Is it somebody that you're just interested in, somebody that you've had a hankering for a long time or all your life, maybe?
yeah, I mean, it's sort of a combination of both. I mean, I signed the deal to do the Bob Newhart book before he passed away, so it had been in the works for a while. But I thought he was such an interesting personality, especially in the world of television. And again, to get a sense of what he was like off stage, which was pretty much like what you saw on the screen. He was very deadpan and very, very soft spoken, but a very, very nice man. I really liked him a lot.
Well, the current book is Nothin Comes Easy about Rodney Dangerfield by Michael Seth Starr. Thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to talking to you again. Hopefully, for Newhart, maybe for Rickles. Maybe combine the 2 books. That'd be kind of an
Yeah,
interesting.
I'd love to. Thank you. Thanks, Ross.
Come on back. Thank you, Michael Seth Starr. Thanks for joining us on Upfront.
Thank you.